Thank you for joining us again for the CoC 201 training series. This module is going to focus again on the CoC NOFA, but specifically about renewals, new projects, and ranking. So we mentioned in a previous module that the CoC NOFA has two major parts. One is the CoC consolidated application, which is the application that the CoC is submitting to HUD, made up of narratives and attachments, basically showing HUD what the CoC has been doing over the past year to address homelessness. And then the other big part of the CoC NOFA is your priority list, which is made up of your renewals, your new projects, and your ranking. So let's break down what the priority list is and what you need to know about renewals, new projects, and ranking. So all individual projects that the CoC is looking to fund must submit their own applications to the CoC for inclusion on the priority list. So this includes renewal projects. So projects seeking to renew their grants must go through an evaluation process each year. The CoC must rank all projects, renewal and new, and those ranked on the bottom may lose funding or not receive new funding. The CoC can also choose to reallocate projects. So in this case, the CoC decides that perhaps a project has had poor performance over the last few years, or perhaps a project is no longer meeting a need in the CoC. The CoC can choose to reallocate that project either in full or in part, and those funds would be directed to another use. Projects can also voluntarily reallocate, which happens sometimes if an organization is no longer able to operate a project or they're really not fulfilling a need in their community. Projects may also choose to voluntarily reallocate their project, and those funds would be redirected to another use. Again, the CoC can fund new projects. HUD puts out money for CoC bonus funding, as well as sometimes for additional uses. In the past couple of years, HUD has put out money for CoC domestic violence bonus funding. So the CoC is going to take both those renewal projects and new projects and then rank them. And again, those ranked on the bottom may lose funding or not be receiving new funding. So in terms of project review, again, each individual project submits their application to the CoC, and the CoC reviews all these project applications, which are submitted via eSnaps. The CoC has to look at new projects very carefully because HUD has certain threshold requirements for new projects. So the CoC will be reviewing those new project applications very carefully in that eSnap system to make sure they pass threshold and they line up with what the CoC approved the new project to do. And then the renewal review, all the renewal projects submit their applications in eSnaps for the CoC to review. And the CoC is reviewing all of those to make sure that they are not going to be held up in contracting. So we're looking at a lot of compliance related things, just making sure the application all looks correct, as well as whether the project is following the CoC's priorities. So let's talk a little bit about new projects. The new project process is different than the renewal process. So when new project funding is available, the CoC will put out a new project solicitation, typically in the form of an RFP, request for proposal. So the funding may be available through the HUD bonus funding, or if the CoC has reallocated existing projects, there may be funding available that way. The funding can also be used to expand existing projects. So before the CoC releases a new project solicitation, the CoCs go through a process to determine what the priorities are for a new project. So the CoC is going through a process to basically see where are the gaps in our CoC, what are the most pressing needs, and then setting priorities that way. So then the CoC will draft, review, and approve for release that new project solicitation. And the goal is to distribute this as widely as possible. HUD wants CoCs to demonstrate that they're open to new partner agencies as applicants. You may be funding the same organizations again and again, but HUD really wants to see that the CoC is engaging new partners. The new project responses to the solicitation are reviewed, and then the new project applicants are selected. And in the Eastern and Western PA CoCs, this is done by the funding committee. Once those new project applicants are selected, they complete a full application in eSnaps. So let's talk a bit about the process for renewal scoring. So again, the CoC has to rank all projects for the priority list. So in the Eastern Pennsylvania CoC, the ranking of renewal projects is assisted through scoring the projects using a common set of criteria. So all renewal projects are scored based on a set of criteria that's used for everyone, all the renewal projects. So these criteria reflect items that both HUD and the CoC have prioritized, and is made up a lot of both objective criteria around performance, data quality, as well as looking at HUD monitoring areas such as your grant management, as well as your participation in the CoC. So HUD awards a considerable number of points to CoCs based on the NOFA scoring and ranking process. So HUD really wants to see that CoCs have an open, fair, and transparent process. A little bit about the process of how the renewal scoring works. So first, the renewal scoring criteria is approved by the funding committee. The agencies submit their scoring information to the CoC. Data is gathered from other sources. So for example, your RAB attendance, we've gathered data from HMIS. Then the projects are scored. The preliminary scores are released. There is an appeals opportunity. So if grantees disagree with their score, or there's an extenuating circumstance they want to be reviewed by the funding committee, they can submit an appeal. The appeals are reviewed by the funding committee, and then grantees are notified of the result of the appeal, and then final scores are released. So only renewal projects with a full year of data can be scored. So if projects do not have a full year of data, they're typically set aside for inclusion in Tier 1. One thing I'll note in addition to this timeline, in advance of the scoring, grantees are given the opportunity to clean up their data and make sure that all of their data is correct. One other note is that the CoC will post everything online. We're required to make this an open and transparent process, so all of the information will be posted on the CoC website. A little bit about reallocation. So the language from the FY 2019 CoC NOFA says, reallocation is a process that CoCs use to shift funds in whole or part from existing eligible renewal projects to create one or more new projects without decreasing the CoC's ARD. So the CoC is keeping that money, but using it for a new purpose. So in other words, it's the process by which funds are taken from one project to be used for new projects. So CoCs can reclaim funding from renewal projects through reallocation. HUD encourages reallocation. HUD wants to see that CoCs are looking at the performance of projects and making sure that they're funding the most effective projects that meet needs within the CoC. Sometimes an agency does do a voluntary reallocation. Typically, this is when they maybe are no longer able to operate the projects, or they're looking to change their project type, for example. CoCs may choose to reallocate funds for some of these reasons. One, the project demonstrates poor performance. Two, the agency consistently fails to spend down all the project funds and is giving money back to HUD. In that case, the CoC may do a full or a partial reallocation. And then sometimes projects are no longer aligned with the needs or priorities of the CoC. So depending upon the circumstances of the reallocation, the CoC may submit a new project solicitation for folks to come in for that funding. Again, reallocation can be partial or full. Full reallocation is where 100% of the project's funds are reclaimed by the CoC, and a partial would be only a portion of the project's funds are reclaimed by the CoC. So once the CoC has scored the renewal projects, that's when the project ranking is done. Again, I'll just note, once they've scored the renewal projects and figured out reallocations and selected new projects, that's when the project ranking begins. So the project ranking determines the order of projects on the priority list. So projects are numbered A project ranked 1 on the priority list is at the top, and then you go from there. There is a strategy in ranking, basically a strategy for CoCs to try to retain as much money as possible. The goal with ranking is to not only be fair in terms of how you're ranking projects based on their performance, but once you get into tier 2, there's a strategy that the CoC uses to try to retain as much money as possible. New projects can be ranked in either tier 1 or tier 2, depending on the CoC's priorities. The CoC's priorities are very important. They matter a great deal when it comes to determining the final ranking for the priority list. So just breaking down who does what in terms of the NOFA, the funding committee is responsible for finalizing the renewal project scoring, making recommendations about full or partial reallocation, identifying funding priorities based on the gaps analysis and input from the CoC, reviewing and finalizing new project solicitations and scoring criteria, and then reviewing those new project applications and approving or denying them. The funding committee reviews appeals, so there's multiple different appeal windows, including for new projects, renewal projects, or projects that are selected for reallocation. And then finally, the funding committee is doing that final ranking of renewal and new projects. The non-conflicted members of the CoC governing board, so the members of the CoC governing board that do not get CoC funding, have a role of reviewing any second appeals. So if a project is denied by the funding committee and they want to appeal, they can appeal to the non-conflicted members of the CoC governing board. The CoC board oversees this collaborative process for the funding competition and provides input around the CoC planning grant. And then the RABs also provide input on the criteria and input on how to prioritize their region's needs. DCED, the collaborative applicant, has a number of responsibilities for the CoC NOFA, and DCED contracts out these NOFA-related tasks to DMA. So the responsibilities for the NOFA that DCED and DMA fulfill is supporting the board and funding committee, developing and implementing funding policies, conducting that renewal scoring process with input from the funding committee, supporting the new project RFP and selection process, doing all of the project reviews in eSnaps, completing the consolidated application, so writing the narrative and compiling the attachments, completing the priority list, applying for planning grant funds, publicly posting all the application materials and ranking in alignment with HUD criteria, and lastly, submitting the application. So you have completed the CoC 101 and 201 training, which is the training that's designed to help you get a more enhanced look at what the CoC is all about. We hope this information has been very helpful to you, and we hope you'll join us for future training opportunities in the future.